Hello and welcome to the High Maintenance Hippie podcast. This is your host, Ashley from Ashley Taylor Wellness. On this podcast, we talk about all things beauty, health, wellness, and optimization. Being a high maintenance hippie represents not being boxed in, as I strongly believe that one size does not fit all. I'm a nurse turned coach, and I have learned so much about both conventional and alternative options, and I want to help you expand your options. I'm here to inspire you to learn new ways to improve your quality of life and to take your power back. I'm so excited that you're here, so let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to the High Maintenance Hippie podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Taylor Burrowes. I'm very excited to have her on today because the most downloaded episode that I've had so far was with Otto on relationships. And so we're going to dive into a lot of topics from an expert's perspective. And I hope that this adds value to your life. So Dr. Taylor has a PhD in counseling, marriage, couples, and family counseling. And she now does coaching, and we'll talk a lot more about that. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Taylor. I am so excited for this conversation.
Me too. And just call me Taylor. I'm cool with that.
Okay. All right. So that'll be easy for me to remember, Ashley Taylor. So when I go on Twitter, I mean, you are very active. You're very active on Instagram. And I think it's really important, the work that you're doing, because in functional medicine coaching, there are 5 pillars, and people think for health, it's about diet and exercise, of course, but sleep. And then at the bottom, it's stress and relationships. And most people don't think relationships have much to do with their health or even their quality of life. And so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important across the board. I mean, it goes both ways too, because when I'm talking to people about their relationships and all of that, I ask them about their physical health too, and if they're taking care of their diet and exercise. So it's definitely a holistic endeavor that we need to be considering the whole person, body, mind, and soul.
So refreshing. Okay, so why did you get into counseling? Was there something that in your life that you experienced, or what was it that made you want to go down that path?
Yeah, I haven't asked that question in a long time. I retired in 2019, and gosh, I mean, my career was everything for a long time. But how I got into it, I remember I took psychology classes in high school, and then I went to my undergrad and I triple majored in psychology, philosophy, and sociology, got the degree in psychology, and then figured out that I wanted to go the counseling route because the dean of psychology said I wasn't that interested in the science research part, like the being in a lab, as much as I was talking to people. So I said, okay, I'll check out counseling. And I did. I really liked it. It has more of I don't know, I guess it feels more personable in a lot of ways. It was created as a field of study that would be master's level requirement versus doctoral level requirement. But I went the long route anyway and got my PhD. But I got really heavily involved in sexual trauma. So I did my master's thesis on sexual trauma. And then that was my focus of my doctoral dissertation as well. And my clinical focus was in childhood sexual abuse and trauma. So I think that was kind of like one of my main motivators, was to try to help children and adult survivors of trauma as well. So it was hard to kind of step away from that for sure, because it's very different. I don't do any of that work anymore, right? Because that's something that has to stay clinical.
Okay. So this was not a question I was planning on asking, but I think just my opinion, and I have shared my own experiences, which has allowed a lot of other people to say, really, you too? And I find that it's pretty common. I don't want to say it's normal, but is it more common than people would think? Children, minors experiencing sexual trauma, or maybe it's not even traumatic. For me, there was no violence. There was no, you're going to do this. It was play. It was play. So then I got older and I learned, oh, I guess that's not play. That's wrong. And so much shame. So, the question really is this something that is more prevalent than people see? There's just a lot of shame around it and people don't talk about it.
I do think it's more prevalent than people think about, because people don't like to think about it. But I'm pretty sure people are aware that it's common. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned something that's really insightful, that a lot of people don't realize, that an actual trauma, it's not necessarily interpreted as trauma to the person who experiences it. And so there can be some kind of implicit dormant effects that don't come up until later on. But ultimately, you have to really examine like the effect it has on a person psychologically and emotionally, because they may have normalized it in a lot of ways. So yeah, there's a lot of layers to it, but for sure, I think people don't like to assume that somebody, let's say they're like popular or well known in the community, that they're capable of abusing children, or even if it's not like a priest and a child, like people
Right.
still, they'll make excuses or try to justify some kind of inappropriate behavior rather than actually acknowledge that what they did was wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's easier to avoid. Sometimes people don't remember, but like I kind of mentioned, it shaped my identity and the beliefs about myself and the people that I attracted from that place. So when I had very low self-worth, I started having sex when I was 11. When I was 12, 13, I took hundreds of naked photos that were passed around. And the FBI actually got involved when I was in my second semester as a freshman in high school. And they're like, who's making you do this? And at the time I was like, I did it because I was trying to get love, maybe not in the healthiest way. There were other things that I did that were published to Pornhub without my consent, and as much consent, I suppose, as you could give at 14 for an act like that. But what my point here is that I started to think I'm not worthy of a high quality man because I've ruined it. It's too late for me. So do you see that a lot? Like a lot of people have been cheated on or have a partner that is physically or maybe mentally, emotionally abusive. They internalize that. And then that's their framework moving forward. And it's not the best place to attract people from. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, and even if it's not like as extreme as that, you might see like single mothers, for instance, they feel like they're damaged goods and they're passed over, that they're going to be sort of villainized as like the red flag, the walking red flag that men don't want to consider as a future wife. And that's not fair, right? Like for
Mm-hmm.
whatever reason, obviously, what's important is actually doing the vetting. So it's not about making snap judgments about people. It's about looking at the context and how the person has grown, learned, healed from all of those things that have happened in their past is what's most important. And so if I mean, it's almost like a red flag around about the other person if they're not even
Sure.
interested in getting to know you beyond some of the stuff that would be on paper.
Yeah. I think that's a great example. A lot of single mothers, but there's a really beautiful story. And I think we need to give our brains evidence of people who are in healthy, happy relationships, because before I was 24, I hadn't really seen that. And I'm like, why would I want to get married? It just seems like people complain about it. It's my ball and chain. But then when I got a little older, I met people who were in relationships. And of course, every relationship has their problems. I think it would be someone's not being honest if there are no conflicts, but it's how we respond to them and all that. But I saw people like, wow, this partnership really seems to add value to your life. And I'm like, that's what I want. So I didn't know that was possible. So we're not going to pursue something if we don't think it's possible for us, or just that it's possible in general.
Yeah, having that relationship model, knowing that there there is a healthy, happy marriage out there is going to allow you to want to strive for that. And yeah, a lot of people don't have that, unfortunately. But do you remember like the first healthy relationship role model you had, or some kind of example of that?
Well, I grew up living in my grandparents' house, and they had a very peaceful relationship. Not a lot of yelling, but they weren't very affectionate. And once again, they're my grandparents, they're much older. So my mom and my dad weren't together from when I was very young. So I didn't see that. So it's not like it was a bad example. It just was not really what I was looking for. Like I didn't necessarily want a relationship like theirs. Not that it was toxic or bad. It just didn't seem like, oh, I would want to commit my whole life to something like that. But my grandmother at 78, after my grandfather passed, most people think you're not going to find love at that age. She doesn't get Botox. She doesn't get work done. And she's a beautiful soul. And she met someone same age as her. And he treats her like a queen. They go on trips. They do all of this stuff. And it's really beautiful. And I shared this on Instagram. And so many women people, but mostly women were triggered by this. Oh, well, it must be because he wants her money or she's going to die soon. And it's so interesting the lens that people see things through instead of, wow, maybe that's possible for me. Maybe there are good people and their spouses pass or something happens. We just, it's interesting that so many people, their mind went there, that
They
you're
look for the
too old.
negative.
Yep. Damaged
Exactly.
goods. It's too old. Why would someone do that though? If they want the relationship, but another piece of their brain is saying it's not possible. What part of the brain is that likely coming from, and why is that?
Well, you would think that someone who's younger is not going to be envious of a 78-year-old woman who's finding love, unless maybe they're single and unhappy. And they're thinking, well, she's not better than I am. Like, how could she get that? Right. Then there's a little bit of that like ego that comes into play and tries to explain it away so that you don't feel so bad about your circumstances. But I was wondering too, Ashley, like in
Mm-hmm.
looking at the healthy relationship role model, if a lot of people don't just look at TV and movies and shows and stuff like that, and if they don't see a lot of examples of that around them, that they kind of imprint on these examples that we're fed in the media.
Yes.
Because I mean, I know I can't think of like one particular marriage or family that comes to mind for me, but I know that I was probably very influenced by that. I mean, I was influenced by my parents. Their relationship was wonderful. They were very much in love. There was just a 35-year age gap,
Mm-hmm.
which was a little controversial, but nobody really brought that up in my community. It was kind of more normal in the Caribbean. But I think a lot of people do kind of see these very volatile, sort of hot and cold relationships, or the very sort of clinical relationships that are just kind of going through the emotions and really boring. There's not a lot of that really good sweet spot in the middle of something that is vivacious, but not a roller coaster, something that takes effort and is healthy, but is also, like goes through the motions too. Like you have to do those practical day-to-day things in order to have a healthy relationship. So learning how to establish that balance is not always easy for us. And we're not taught
Yes.
it all the time.
Exactly. We're not taught it. And self-preservation, like our conscious mind might say, I want a relationship. But if we have all of these beliefs about how hard it is, that it's not possible, at some point we might self-sabotage and just retreat back to our comfort zone. Not because it's not possible, but because we don't want to experience more pain or suffering. So that's interesting. And I do think that I saw, maybe it was on Twitter, but some people had some things to say about the age difference in your parents. So this is how I look at it. If I am 15, I'm probably not going to date someone. So what would be that 50 years old, two different stages in life. But I think once we are adults, once we are older, it's really about finding a partnership that's going to work. And you've really been so honest about some people want a young, attractive person, and some people want the stability of an older man. So for me, as long as it's an adult, I don't see that being an issue. But if someone's in college and someone's getting ready to retire, I think those are two different stages in life. But what do you say about that? Because I think some people didn't understand, and that's
It
okay if they don't
triggered a lot of
understand.
people for sure.
Yeah,
I had someone respond to one of these videos yesterday, and people assume I'm just supportive of age gaps like blankly, but I'm not. Like it depends on the situation, right?
of
And
course.
so this was a man who was 60, and he asked me, "Is it okay if I like this 20-year-old girl?" And I said, "Well, that is a significant age gap, and it doesn't sound like you know her very well.
Mm-hmm.
I would not pursue a sexual or romantic relationship with her. You have to vet each other and you have to determine whether this woman is even interested in you and take it slowly." That is the
Mm-hmm.
big thing is when you're talking about a young woman, don't rush into anything romantic at all. You have to prolong that vetting process. And ideally, if you are in a like smaller community, I know obviously that's hard to come by these days, but if there was some kind of proximity to the family, then having some kind of conversation with the family first would be most appropriate. But we've kind of far removed ourselves from those types of relationships these days. But ultimately, if the person is healthy, if you bring the best out in each other, if you are compatible. And people often, talk about you're in two different generations, you don't share anything in common, but that's not true all the time. I mean, obviously there's a lot of things that are probably different, but like whether you listen to pop or classical is not the issue. Compatibility is about bigger core values. So you can align on deeper, bigger, macro level core values, but you don't share the same interests because interests are not that important. Lifestyle choices and value systems and goals are what's important. And the actual bond between the two of you. Like I said, if you bring the best out in each other and you're healthy for each other, all of those things are what matter most.
Yeah. And I mean, I gave the example in your 20s and 50, but in this case, it's 25 and 60. So I don't think that that's wrong. I think it's important for people. Once again, are we compatible? Do we want the same things? Do we share the same values? And it is less likely when you're in two different places in life. But if you've got that good communication and you're on the same page, great. 15 and 50, to me, that's a no. But I think by 25, most people know who they are and what they want. And so it's also about being an adult versus, 35 years, 0 to 35 is very different from 25 to 60, So I think it's important to just respect what's right for other people. And since you also have a background in sexual trauma, especially affecting children, I think it's important to both of us to preserve the innocence of children. So that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about consensual adults doing what's right for them. And every relationship's going to look different.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, it's definitely not okay to be grooming a teenager or anything like that. But where it gets blurred is at 18, like 18 to 22 is a gray area that, okay, some people are just like, well, they're an adult. It shouldn't matter. She can do what she wants. And some people are like, you have to wait until the girl is 25 because the brain isn't fully formed, yada, yada, yada. There is mixed evidence on that. And again, I'm just going to default to the general opinion that I have, which is you have to take it on a case by case basis and you have to look at the individual, because if they were brought up in an environment that was very healthy and was close knit, then that 20-year-old might be way more mature than a 27-year-old who was brought up in the city and basically raised themselves and has been sort of gallivanting around on her own, making a lot of mistakes, right? So you can't sort of just judge it on the age, but ultimately, yes, of course, it's 18 or whatever the age of consent is in that jurisdiction at a minimum.
Yes. So getting to vetting, what is vetting? How would you describe that?
Vetting is the way that you select not just a person for a romantic relationship. It could just be anything, right? Like vetting is how you make a decision for yourself, like what is right for you. I talk about it like even material things, like the house that you're going to move into. It could be a friendship. It could be a job. It could be so many different things. But I mean, obviously vetting, I think it was coined in regards to employee selection. And so the term vetting came up in an employment corporate setting. And there were people that were hired to vet potential employees. And so the difference with this, though, is vetting in that sense was fill the role, right? Like whatever the empty spot was, you just had to find the best person to fit it. Whereas the way that I use vetting in relationships and in dating, it's the spot needs to stay empty until you find the right person, not just pick the best person that you can find right now in order to fill that role, if that distinction makes sense to you.
Okay. And it's really important because most people do not consciously enter relationships. And I will speak from personal experience. I have an attraction. And because I had very low self-worth, I wanted to get that validation from them. And I noticed usually when someone would tell me that they loved me, then I'm like, oh, then what's wrong with them? And then I would go on to the next one and the next one. This was like in my teens and my 20s. It was very interesting where that came from. So I didn't take time to get to know people. I would sleep with them very quickly. Then I am intimately connected. And then I don't care how many red flags are waving or were waving, I wasn't looking at them because I had that connection already there. So as I'm sure you know, and if you're listening, my partner now, Otto, and we've been together 6 years, but we split in January. We were not planning on getting back together. And it was very important to me that I stayed single for a year because I've never done that before and been happy about that and really get to know myself, think about what I want in a partner and say no to anything that isn't that. And I think that's hard because scarcity comes in. Well, what if there's nobody else? So when you're helping people vet, what things would you suggest? I would say getting to know someone slowly before trying to lock it down quickly. That came from a wounded place for me, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. So what things are you suggesting for people to consider?
Yeah, it's really important not to rush into it, right? Like when it comes to selecting the right person to be with, you have to be able to emotionally regulate, right? Because if you're only making your decisions based on feelings, which is love or lust, then you're going to be rushing things and you might be rushing into the wrong thing. So, vetting really the emphasis is on the compatibility,
Mhm.
which has been neglected for decades, right? I think that the history of relationships, like before the 20th century, right? Like there was much more courting and arranged, like sort of soft arrangements that were made in families. And then dating sort of started in the 50s and 60s. And then the sexual liberation sort of era came about, and then casual sex and dating for fun rather than dating intentionally for marriage was the predominant thing. And so now I think the pendulum is swinging back towards the middle where we're looking for that sweet spot of, yeah, we want to have autonomy in who we select, but we also don't want to just be out there chaotically connecting and attaching to people and having casual sex frequently, right? Like this is not like obviously conducive to a healthy psyche or a healthy relationship in the long run. So vetting is allowing you to figure out yourself first, like what you said, being self-aware and knowing what matters to you, identifying what your needs are, your values are, your goals, your ideal lifestyle, what your purpose is in life. Like the more you can clarify who you are, and you don't have to complete that, but you want to be on track. You want to be on the path of that self awareness. Then you're going to make better decisions because the person who's compatible for you is going to be someone who represents those things. They're going to be in alignment with those things. So if you don't know who you are, the likelihood is that you're just going to be chasing your feelings. That's kind of the
Yes.
long and short of it.
So let's say I'm not very conscious about it and I just go with who I'm attracted to. Where might that come from? Where do most people's attractions come from?
Well, we do have biological urges, right? So I think some of that is hard to explain. It's intangible. And that's going to be like our neurotransmitters that are firing when we see someone or we're next to someone that we're attracted to. So anything that makes us feel pleasure or happiness and when we feel bonded to people, we're going to be drawn to them. So those are obviously like oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine. And then we also going to have the just literal aesthetics, right? Like so if you see someone that is, I don't like to say your type, but someone who is in the realm of your taste aesthetically, right? Because we should have a range of preferences, not just fixate on one particular type. So whether that's like, just a beautiful woman or if it's a very handsome man, obviously the stereotype of like tall, strong, fit, good cheekbones, bone structure, good dresser, whatever the case may be. And then it's going to be like social aspects or, how they interact with you, if they're confident, if they're charming, maybe even like obviously they share some of the same interests, right? Or
Mhm.
like I say, interests are not indicative of compatibility, but we do tend to gravitate towards people who share our interests. So that's where the vetting needs to come into. So whether that's, activities, physical activities, hobbies, or even like church or various things that we do in our regular day-to-day lives. So anything like that we may be attracted to, people who are like us, we tend to pay attention to. So there's lots of different factors. It's definitely multi-layered, but
Mhm.
I think a lot of times people, this is kind of a tangent, but I think it is important to mention. People often give intuition or I would say they misrepresent what intuition is. It's almost like this gut feeling. So they'll justify their gut feeling and just act on things, but really it's impulse.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a big proponent of intuition. Trust me, I really, really am. But often people are just triggered or they're just reacting and they call it intuition. So they'll think this attraction that they have for someone is intuitive, is instinctual. And so they use that as an excuse to just go for it, right? So I just wanted to mention that because I do think I see that misconception brought up a lot.
Yeah. So, what is familiar, we might feel safe in that, even if it's not necessarily what's best for us. And I think a really great example is Stockholm syndrome. It doesn't make sense to go back to an abuser, right? But a lot of people will choose partners that are not healthy for them. And they know that, and they'll verbalize that, and they still go back. So why do you think a person would stay or even enter a relationship that they know isn't good for them, but something else might be driving them?
Well, you're right. I think, your early childhood experiences or your early relationship experiences do shape you a lot. So if you have that insecure attachment, if you have been especially exploited in many relationships, you're going to see that as what you should be looking for. Someone who is kind of push pull, hot and cold, someone who triggers those unhealthy aspects of our psychology where we feel insecure and we feel like we need to impress someone and gain approval and the whole chasing thing, right? Like I see all these videos on Instagram and TikTok and everything about how to get a man to chase you or how to get a woman to chase you. Like none of that is good. You should not be trying to get anyone to chase you because that is a sign, a red flag. That is a sign of an unhealthy person. So pursuit is different. Obviously, a woman wouldn't necessarily pursue a man, but she would be receptive to pursuit. She would be, open to being pursued. But I think that all of these dysfunctional dynamics that people have normalized for a long time are really just about excitement,
Hmm. Yeah.
and basically what we've been conditioned into lately in this modern world is just those dopamine hits. And when
Yeah.
we feel like we don't have enough excitement in our life, we are ending up like looking to vices and piling up all these unhealthy vices in our life in order to feel something. Because maybe people are feeling numb or feeling alone. A lot of people are feeling alone and like not understood or disconnected. And like that intensity is mistaken for intimacy.
Yes. I'm really glad that you said that. That was a big mistake that I would make. I would feel this intense feeling. And I mean, it was like, I don't even want to call them rose-colored glasses, but it was like I couldn't see anything bad about any of these people. And then it's kind of like this all or nothing thinking. So I'd be with someone, and this is like 10, 15 years ago. I'm not proud of this. I'm just sharing like where I have grown. I would not prioritize my friendships. I would make this man the center of my world and always on standby. I wasn't like, hey, I'm on standby, but that was the energy that I had. So there was no need to make plans because I would just say yes or no. I was contributing to a dynamic that wasn't what I really wanted, but I didn't feel worthy of something else. And I also wanted to say that, it's not our conscious mind that's thinking a lot of this. It's subconscious. And so people don't realize how much that drives us and what feels right. But just because something feels right, that discernment between that impulse or intuition is really important. So I love that you mentioned that. So, the first, you mentioned serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. So those chemicals are surging for about how long?
Oh gosh, I think it's a couple of months. I don't know exactly. We'll have to get that data back.
But roughly. So that's my understanding too. So it might feel like love, but for me, I don't really believe that I'm in love day one of meeting someone. I might be seeing the potential to possibly create that, but I think there's a lot of, I don't want to say a fantasy, but like we want something in our mind and we see it, and then we're not looking at the situation clearly because we've got all of these feel good chemicals and hormones, and it can be hard to see the situation clearly. So I think having that, knowing who you are, knowing your values, what's important to you before getting into a relationship is going to allow you to think more clearly versus maybe being bogged by, oh, what I want is right in front of me. And when maybe if you didn't have that person or that bond yet, you might choose differently.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you talk to men and women, men tend to say they fell in love at first sight, actually, more than women in my experience. And I've gotten a lot of pushback from them. So trying to tell them, no, that really wasn't love. That was lust or infatuation. They get
Mhm.
very defensive. They get so upset because oftentimes it does end up working out. Like there are plenty of instances where a man ends up saying, I'm going to marry that woman. And
Mm-hmm.
then it does work out. And so they're telling these stories about how they've been married for 30 years and they fell in love at first sight. And I said to them, well, yes, what happened was you were in lust and infatuated, but then you actually did the right thing, verified compatibility, realized you were alignment in your goals, and it developed into love. So
Mm-hmm.
that was the outcome. But in the beginning, it's not. So you don't need to have that head over heels sort of experience in order for it to work. I think a lot of people assume if you don't have that,
Mm-hmm.
but I would say that a man's clarity is extremely important. And if a man isn't sure that you are the right woman for him to settle down with, and he's ambivalent, then that's probably not going to work out in the end because he's usually the one that's clearer sooner.
Interesting. Okay. So, what are some of the needs that men versus female might have? And we're all human, we all have needs for love. But generally speaking, if there are roles, and this doesn't mean that, if you're a female, you can't be the more masculine role in that relationship. It's really about the polarity. That's my understanding. But let's just say we are speaking about heterosexual couples, a man and a woman, and this is traditional courting. What is the man's role and what do you believe is the female's role? And this is just your opinion. So if anyone's listening and they disagree, that's okay. But what do you think?
Yes, I like to tell people I'm just teaching you or talking about what I teach my clients. And so my clients are people who align with me and my values. And if you don't,
Mm-hmm.
that's totally fine. But I'm here to share a perspective. So you don't have to have the same one. But I feel pacing is ultimately the man's responsibility in a relationship. That doesn't mean that the woman shouldn't also be aware and cognizant of pacing. But I feel that the man is the one that ultimately should be responsible for it because the woman in general is more emotional. She's going to be more beholden to her reactivity. And so the man is going to have more composure, he's going to have more clarity, and he's going to be leading the scenario. So, yeah, in that sense, like it's important to maybe pace out, like space out your contacts, your dates. I think a lot of people rush into the first date for sure. And so I
Okay.
teach people to vet before the first date because I don't think it's good to date strangers. That might sound kind of stuffy or I don't know, like I'm a prude or something, but I think that you can do a lot of vetting before you ever meet someone. And a lot of times people will go on a date and it's just not enjoyable. It's uncomfortable. It's a waste of time, energy, money. And you could have saved yourself by just having a phone call beforehand, doing a little bit of reconnaissance, like find out more about this person on their social media profiles, because there's a lot of information out there that you can glean that would be helpful to determine their values, their personality, and stuff like that. So I think that's one of the most important things to be aware of when you're starting out in the dating world, because especially on dating apps, because people will just match and then meet. So they're basically
Okay.
strangers. And I think that can be kind of dangerous.
Okay. So I have a follow up question that I want to ask you on that. But so I believe it is the man's role to lead, but I hadn't really experienced that. When you said pacing, what do you mean? Like setting the tone about how frequently contact is occurring?
Yeah, well, women can be they should be enthusiastic. If they like you, a woman should be more enthusiastic than the man. And I don't mean she should like you more than he does. But enthusiasm meaning demonstrated enthusiasm, right?
Okay.
Man should not be more demonstrative than the woman. And so when it comes to that enthusiasm, she might pressure it along. She might want to see you 3 times, 4 times this week. She might be texting you constantly throughout the day. And so the man needs to have more of that constitution of leading and directing so that he can pace it. And it doesn't mean sort of brushing her aside, but tactfully redirecting her or responding to her in a more proactive way, taking the reins of that responsibility because she might not be thinking about it as much, about like, well, we're going too fast. I need to slow down, catch my breath, and stuff like that. So I think pacing in regards to spacing out the dates and making sure that you're not like flooding each other with contact. And it's important to have good communication, but good communication is not about intensity. Again, like it's about consistency and about responsiveness. So being able to clarify what those boundaries are is really important. If you don't want to, talk nonstop every single day, then you should be able to mention that. You should be able to say, well, I'm busy at work during the day. I might not be able to get back to you until the evening time or the next day, but I will, like those kinds of reassurances are helpful.
Yeah, I'm the type of person, like I said, I would just go all in and that became my whole world. It was kind of desperate energy, maybe even a little obsessive, not attractive. And I think the belief system that I had was if I say no or if I'm unavailable, then they're going to forget about me. Well, if someone's really interested and you say no, they're going to ask you another time. Like, we do not have to be a doormat to get love. In fact, I think that was a huge mistake that I was making. I was too available. And it's not about game playing. It's just, if you meet someone and they are suddenly your entire world in a month, then how strong was your sense of self? And what is that doing to your other relationships? So it's just something to think about. If you, similar to me many years ago, would do that. I think it's we get excited, but getting to know people is one of the most important things that I've learned. And I didn't sleep with Otto right away. We got to know each other over several months, and there really wasn't that pressure because I wasn't trying to date him. It's a long story, but I was just very honest and I didn't have attachment to it working out. So sometimes we'll also be who we think or say what we think the person wants us to say because we want to be chosen. We want to be in a relationship. We want to feel validated. We may not consciously realize that's what we're doing, but I think that was very true for me. Okay, so going back to men. So men are leaders. Let's have them pace it out. No, if you're in a lesbian relationship, how's that going to work?
Well, I mean, someone's going to be leading the way. So usually there's someone who's more on the masculine end of the spectrum than the feminine end. But, there are going to be cases where it's 2 feminine women or 2 masculine men. But I think ultimately you're going to find your rhythm because that's how compatibility works. That's how polarity works. You're not going to necessarily be attracted to someone, even in those situations, that's so similar to you. It's almost like you're dating yourself, right?
Yes.
So the natural polarity will create that distinction.
Can you explain polarity to someone who hasn't heard that phrase before? So what does that mean and why is it important?
It's a very complicated concept. So if you're listening to this and it doesn't make sense, like don't be too hard on yourself. I have a pinned post on my Instagram about masculinity and femininity that I think is really helpful for a lot of people. So go ahead and look at that.
We'll add it to the show notes for you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the main things is that we both, like men and women, both have masculine and feminine energy. It's not gender specific. So the goal is to find a way to calibrate our energy inside of us as an individual in a way that is the most healthiest for us. So typically, if you're a woman, that's going to be more feminine energy, like a majority of feminine energy and a minority of masculine energy. And so the way that you can categorize these things, which is a little bit subjective, right? It's hard for everyone to agree on what that is or what it isn't. But the way that I define it is, things like integrity, discipline, structure, order, rationality, right? Those are more masculine energy activities. whereas feminine things are going to be more emotional, and it's almost like the yin and the yang, right?
Right.
Or it is
It's a
the
great
yin
way to
and
put it.
yang.
Yes.
So recognizing there's some things that are going to go under the umbrella of the yin, the feminine side, and like the being, the passivity, and then the masculine is going to be more goal directed, and it's going to be more about doing and achieving. And we need to have that, right? Like a healthy woman has a good amount of that. But what
Mm-hmm.
has been happening a lot is that you'll see a lot of women now that, we're predominantly in the working world, or have been, that a lot of women are becoming more masculinized, and they're losing touch with some of their feminine aspects. I know that happened
Yeah.
to me.
Same.
So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, a lot of the women clients that I work with, they want to calibrate their energy better to find a nice polarity in themselves. And so polarity is first and foremost something that you have inside of you. And if you can calibrate or integrate, right? It's about integration, finding that sweet spot for yourself. I use the 80-20 rule.
Mm-hmm.
So 80% femininity and 20% masculinity. Not that I take out a pen and paper and calculate my energy, but just as a general guideline,
Mm-hmm.
that works for me. And that's what I suggest as a good sort of threshold. And when you're able to have that connection with somebody else who has also established that healthy integration in their polarity, then that's when it's like literally that yin and yang symbol, right? Coming together. You create the most harmonious union together, because it's almost like, I mean, the cliche is you complete each other, but obviously you're already complete because you've integrated your own masculinity and femininity, right? So that's what it's like, a 5-dimensional thing, and it creates this bigger entity that works. So you're going to have, and it fluctuates too. I think that's also really important
True.
to tell people that it's not like you're a stagnant,
Mm-hmm.
feminine woman in this way in all situations. It's going to be a constant dance with your partner, right? Like he may be more feminine in one situation and you might be more masculine, or vice versa. So ultimately it's just going to be being in tuned to each other, and yeah, just flowing together. So
Yeah.
it's not always simple to explain, but it's something you're constantly aware of, or working toward.
Yes. And I'll give you a couple examples. So in my business, I'm going to have more masculine energy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a doer. I'm getting things done. I've got to make calls, do meetings, put projects together. Although in coaching and nursing, there is the ability for me to tap into that nurturing side. So I'm very grateful. But typically, work is where we might have more of that masculine energy. In my relationship, though, that's not serving me. Sexually, that is not serving me. So I am learning as I feel safer. And, I wouldn't say, if a man's going to lead, just let anybody lead you. I think it's important, once again, to vet, to see what their values are. Do you want the same things? Don't just blindly follow anyone. But ideally, you have a partner that you trust, that does have your best interest in mind, you two as a couple, and you can communicate what you want. So one example is, I saw a video on Instagram, and it was asking if women should say to their partner, if it's a man, I would like for you to take me to this restaurant. I don't see that as emasculating, because I see it as, I'm letting you know what I want, and he's planning it, making it happen, taking me, all of that. Is that robbing the masculine of his ability to lead and take me out? Or is that communicating what I want so that he can do it? What do you think about that?
That actually is quite controversial. I remember someone talking about planning dates and how the man should plan all the dates. And I'm like, but wait a minute, it's a very feminine quality to be like the special event coordinator. Like, that's not a masculine thing. Like, men like to sit back, and women in families are the ones that are coordinating all the birthday parties and the Thanksgiving this and that. So it's both. It depends on what aspect you're talking about. But men obviously are going to be romancing you, right? But being able to clarify and communicate what you like is important. And
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a neutral thing. Like, you both have to do that. You both have to be good communicators. But I do think that clear and effective communication is probably more of the masculine coming out. It's an integrated form of it, right? Because women are not necessarily the better communicators. that's kind of I think misinformed assumption that people have, because women talk about their emotions a lot more, but I find that men can be much more effective, clear communicators. So you need to have both in a lot of these circumstances. And so that's why I do focus on integrating both of those aspects, because men also need to know how to identify their emotions and be able to connect to their emotions. So yeah, I don't think you have to worry about emasculating Otto in that situation, but just how you do it might be really important, right? Like
True.
you
Yes.
want to like warm him up to it and be sassy or sweet, and not necessarily like you've got your work mode on, your spectacles and your pointing fingers and all that sort of stuff, you know?
Yeah. And one of the biggest mistakes that I made was that I was so in my masculine, which once again, it's not bad. There's a time and a place, but in my relationship, it wasn't serving me. And something that I learned is that love is not control. I was very much trying to monitor his behavior so he didn't say the wrong thing. We were very codependent. And even my friends called me out on that. And they're like, he's his own person. He says a bunch of crazy stuff, but that's for him to say. So I had to back off. That's one thing that in our uncoupling, when we were doing relationship 2.0, love is not control. And we disagree on a lot of things, but we have that respect and that we do things differently. So I was just so critical, nitpicky, and I thought it was coming from a good place, but it wasn't helping him or the relationship. Thank you for listening to the High Maintenance Hippie podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, rate it, and leave a review, ideally a 5-star review if you loved it. All of this is free of charge and really helps me to be able to run the podcast. If you take a screenshot and tag me, I'll repost you and shout you out on Instagram. So tag Ashley Taylor Wellness and High Maintenance Hippie Podcast. If you have any feedback or guests that you'd like to have, I would love to hear from you so that I'm not just talking at you. I really want to deliver things that are valuable. So send me an email with any feedback, suggestions, or ideas for guests at ashley@ashleytaylorwellness.com. And I will leave you with a disclaimer. Please know that this is not medical advice or replacement for seeking medical care. Everything discussed on this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Always consult with your medical provider before making any changes. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.